I'm Rabbi Josh, co-lead of Progressive Judaism. I'm currently CEO of the Movement for Reform Judaism, but I'm not here wearing that hat. So this evening I'm wearing the hat of lecturer at Leo Baeck College, where for about the last decade I have taught a fourth year class on what's called progressive rabbinic decision making. And a lot of the focus of that is on how does our sort of legal tradition impact on or influence the way that we think as progressive rabbis and how we make our decisions as progressive Jews. So it is wearing that hat that you find me here. The topic for this evening is our relationship with Jewish law. So it's worth us just thinking about what we mean when we're talking about Jewish law. What is it that we're speaking about? Um, so Jewish tradition has always contained within it a legal component, as well as our stories, as well as our theology and beliefs, as well as our values and ideas. Judaism has also always said that how we behave matters and has always included prescriptions about how we behave. That is, there's always been a bit of our tradition which is about what God wants us to do, presented as legal traditions. So that obviously begins with the biblical mitzvot, the 613, as the rabbis counted them, commandments that we find in Torah, but also includes sort of the rabbinic um, corpus, this very large rabbinic corpus about how we're supposed to behave, which includes the product of rabbinic interpretation of our legal tradition in Torah, but also rabbinic innovations as well, including some mitzvot that the rabbis kind of invent, as well as the ones interpretations of how we might fulfill the ones that are in Torah. So very simplistically, what we're talking about is um, how does our tradition think that God wants us to behave? And our tradition's expression of that as a kind of legal tradition, as a set of laws. Um, our legal tradition is incredibly broad and wide. Um, there are thousands of halachot, of different laws that we inherit as part of our tradition. When we use the word halacha literally means kind of going or walking, or it's how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to walk in the world, and is the rabbinic word for kind of that legal tradition that we have. And rabbinic halacha covers pretty much every aspect of human life. And there is something that our tradition says about almost everything that we might do during our day to day lives. In rabbinic literature, it's presented as a kind of dialogue, a conversation across generations. And often, one of the important things to recognize is that in rabbinic literature, really it's presented as a book of ideas rather than the book of law. But in the medieval period, we actually receive it also as literally as a law code. So there is an exercise of codification. In the medieval period, this kind of huge development of kind of rabbinic conversation about how does God want us to behave, which includes lots of voices about how we should be. That gets codified into sort of legal code, and that's how we then receive it as a legal tradition. What we're going to look at is five examples from our legal tradition. These are five pieces taken specifically from the medieval rabbinic codes of Jewish law. And the five examples that I've chosen because they represent different aspects or different kinds of tradition. And that these are those traditions really presented in rabbinic form, in legal form. One thing to say is that all of these are rabbinic traditions. So they are the distillation of a rabbinic conversation into a kind of legal form. So the first text that we're going to look at is from a code called the Arba Turim, which is the second kind of big authoritative medieval code. We'll look at the first a little later. It's called the Arba Turim, which means the four rows, because it is presented as or organized around four different types of material. And what we're looking at is from the section, one of those four sections called Orach Chaim, which means sort of the way of life, and is really the kind of legal material about how do we do Jewish ritual. That's essentially what it is. And the reason I've chosen this is because we're 2 days after Shavuot. And for most of us, many of us who went to shul on either on Sunday evening or on Monday morning, what we were doing was reflected in or comes out of this particular legal tradition. So, what is our tradition? The tradition is that the 50th day of the counting of the Omer is the holiday of Shavuot, Chag Shavuot. And what does this tell us? Seder HaTfilah, Kamo B'Yom Tov Shel Pesach, that the liturgy for and the ritual for Shavuot is the same ritual as we used on Yom Tov, for Pesach. And then it says, Ela, except that we say in our Amidah, Yom Chag Shavuot Hazeh Zman Matan Toratenu. This festival day of Shavuot, the time of the giving of our Torah. So whether you were praying from Seder Tfilot, the forms of prayer of the Reform movement, or whether you were using Siddur Lev Chadash, in your Amidah on Monday morning, you use that line. When you got to the section that says of what's known as Kedushat Hayom, the declaration of the sanctification of the day, what you used was, what you described was Yom Chag Shavuot Hazeh Zman Matan Toratenu, this festival day of Shavuot, the time of giving of our Torah. And this is where it came from. This is the legal tradition. Actually, this is the first that I'm aware of codification of that as being what we should liturgically say. This particular halakha goes on to also tell us that we should sing Hallel, which we will have done in many of our communities. It goes on to tell us that we should read the Ten Commandments, which we will have done in most of our communities on Monday morning. It also tells us a second Torah scroll that we would have read, which we would not have read in most of our communities because it was a description of the sacrificial process, and in neither Reform or Liberal Judaism would that have been in our lectionary. And it also will have told us a haftarah, which isn't the haftarah that either of us would have had in our liturgy or in our lectionary either. So this is our first halacha, is a halacha of ritual for Shavuot. A second halacha, when we were reading Torah on Monday morning, who got called to Torah and how many people did it? So actually, because it was Shavuot, it would have been, if we were in a different kind of community, it would have been 5. But this text from Shulchan Aruch, which is talking about Shabbat Torah reading, tells us that 7 will get called to Torah. Shulchan Aruch is a later code. It builds on the work of the Arba Turim, and is the authoritative text of Jewish law. It remains, if you went into an Orthodox rabbi and said, Rabbi, tell me the halacha on Torah reading, they would probably know it. But if they didn't, they would take this book off the shelf and they would open it up, and this is what they would read to you. And so it was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in Sfat in the 16th century. And it becomes authoritative because it gets a gloss, a kind of an additional sections that get written into it, which is written in Ashkenaz by Rabbi Moshe Isserles. And so it becomes authoritative because it reflects both the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi traditions of that time. And we'll see a little bit of Isserles in a moment. So this is what our tradition here says. Anyone can be called up to Torah for one of the 7, to be one of the 7 aliyot Torah. Afilu isha v'katan, even a woman or a child, as long as they know how to do the blessings. Aval amru chachamim, but the sages tell us that a woman is not called up to read Torah in public with the community, mipnei kavod hatzibor, because of what is known as kavod hatzibor, concern for the honor of the community. That is, the halacha is that anyone can be called to Torah to do the blessings as long as they're Jewish and they know how to do it. But we don't call women to Torah according to the rabbinic legal tradition, because somehow that would be dishonoring of the rest of the community. We will come back to it. A third legal tradition. We're going to do 5 and then we'll have an opportunity to reflect together. This is a legal text about Shabbat. This is taken from the first really authoritative code of Jewish law, which is known as the Mishneh Torah, which is the great work of, or one of the great works of Moshe ben Maimon of Maimonides. It's compiled at the end of the 12th century, and it's sometimes known as the Yad Chazakah, the strong hand, because it's arranged in 14 different books. And this is from the Mishneh Torah. This is a law of Shabbat. Chapter 1 of his Hilchot Shabbat tells us all about the rules of Shabbat, what we should do, what we should not do, goes through the 39 different types of work from which we should refrain on Shabbat. And then Shabbat 2.1 says, all of these laws that I've just told you are suspended in a case where there's a danger to life, as are all mitzvot. For a sick person whose life is in danger, we may perform anything that is necessary in Shabbat, following the instruction of someone who's qualified to give us medical instructions in that place. So I haven't brought all of the preceding halachot around what we should do on Shabbat, but here is a halacha that says that saving someone's life supersedes all of the laws of Shabbat. So it's a piece of halakha that expresses a ritual obligation, but it also expresses a value about what's really important, about the importance of looking after people's life. And there's a rabbinic dictum, pikuach nefesh docher takol. The saving of a life supersedes everything else. And this is an example of that rabbinic idea expressed in legal form. Here's another legal text. This one again is from the Shulchan Aruch. And this is about our behavior, not towards God, not in our ritual lives, not on Shabbat, but how we behave to one another in the context of community. So here it says, mitzvah levaker cholim. It is a religious obligation to visit the sick. If we had more time to study together, we might want to ask, where do they find this mitzvah, this obligation in Torah? It's not obvious necessarily. But here it gets codified. Relatives and friends can go in to see someone who's sick immediately. But others need to wait a few days until they're settled where they are. But if illness overcomes the patient, that is, if they're really in kind of danger and they really need it, anyone can come in immediately. And then it continues. Even a prominent person, it says Hagadol, a great one, can go in to visit someone who is lesser, who is humble. And going more often is praiseworthy as long as one is not disturbing the person who is unwell by visiting them too much. So here we have halacha as guide to gemilut chasadim, the obligations that we have to look after one another in our interactions with other people. One last example of a halakha, and then we will think a little bit about what we do with all this stuff I've just thrown at you. So the halakha, our legal tradition, doesn't only talk about our ritual lives, it doesn't only talk about our communal lives, it covers every aspect of what we do. Much of it will feel like it is referring to areas of our lives which no longer apply. And this might be an example. So this is the first text that we study together when we're doing my year 4 class at Leabeck College. And we ask what we do with this text. So this is my question for you. What do we do with this text? This is also from the Shulchan Aruch. It's very early on. It's one of the first halachot in this authoritative text of Jewish law. And it tells us when we get up in the morning, we have to think about every aspect of our lives. And it tells us how to put our shoes on in the morning. So, according to Jewish law, when we get dressed in the morning, we should put on the right shoe. Then we should put on our left shoe. And then we tie our left shoe. And then we go back and we tie our right shoe. That is Jewish law on how to tie your shoes. But I told you before that the Shulchan Aruch has this gloss by Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who's living in Krakow. And this is what he says. He says, our shoes don't have ties. We wear wellies. So in our case, where we don't have fastenings, we just put the right one on first, and then we put on the left one. And it will go on to tell us also how we are going to take our shoes off as well. So when we're thinking about Jewish law, these are the sorts of traditions that we're thinking about together. The question for us as progressive Jews is, how do we react to these laws? What status do they have for us? And what do we do them? Do we tomorrow morning, when you guys get up in the morning, do you put on your right shoe first and your left shoe? Because now we know that that's Jewish law, that's what we should do. What do we do with the fact that, as we've been going through these halachot, we've also found that some of them articulate ideas which are in tension with our values? And in particular, when we were thinking about who is called to Torah, a consideration that we would probably definitely describe as misogynistic and problematic and not in line with our Jewish values, that says that calling women to Torah is somehow problematic within our according to would be problematic in community, which we would not believe. So how do we then differentiate between the halakha we might like, the one that tells us it's an obligation to visit the sick, and a halakha we might not like, one which tells us that women should not be called to Torah? And what do we do when we find ourselves in those tensions? Because that's the question for us as progressive Jews. Alex, it's lovely to see you.
Hi, thank you. So, in the morning, I don't put any shoes on at all because I go downstairs first of all and do all of my bits which I have to do, and I don't put any shoes on till I actually leave the house. And I've never thought about putting my right one on before my left one, to be quite honest. Funny enough, I've actually spoken to my Chavruta partner when we study the Pasha every week, about this, the 613 mitzvot, and that some of them wouldn't actually be done now. Something, like the sin offering. You don't bring turtle doves to the priests because it just isn't there physically now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as progressive Jews, we can work around that. And yeah, I think we should find ways to work around that and still sort of stick within the rules as much as we can.
Great. So there's a lot there, Alex. Thank you for that. So there's a lot there to kind of unpick together. So one thing to say is our halachic legal tradition that we inherit, not all of it is actually doable, right? So and a lot of it is from a different period in terms of our religious lives. That is, you're quite right. A lot of the legal tradition, particularly something like the Mishnah Torah, expresses what we're supposed to do in the temple. Well, we don't have a temple, so that stuff by its nature is no longer present. But there are other aspects of it which are specifically about how do we how does the Jewish community work in a time at which there is Jewish sovereignty, right? And not just not this is not a session on Israel, but essentially a theocracy in which Jewish law is the defining practice of a state. A lot of the halakha also talks about that. How should a Jewish government or Jewish king act? But then there's quite a lot that we can do or not do, and there's a question about how authoritative it is and how we relate to it. So and what do we do with the bits that we don't like? Do we lean towards them? Do we give them? Is it our? Do we have a bias in favor of halakha by virtue that it's there? But what do we do with the bits that we don't like, and why are we giving authority to these texts anyway? What do they speak to in us? Linda, it's lovely to see you. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Great.
I haven't muted. Okay. It makes me think about, I've got a ballet residential weekend coming up, and we had to write Devarim Torahs, and I chose Bahalotecha 12:1 to 16, and it sort of goes, or goes to the issue of women, as it were, and gender and equality or inequality in terms of Miriam and Aaron both criticizing Moses in relationship to his wife and her punishment. Miriam is punished, but Aaron is not. And again, we see a situation where the rabbis struggle to try to explain why this is, although in those days they don't seem to struggle too much. We've kind of, jettisoned all that. And I will be reading from the scroll at the weekend. And we certainly do that in my shul, and so too do our rabbis, both reform and liberal and now progressive. But I think that it's sort of the various interpretations to me seem to ignore what some modern interpretations play at the center of the inconsistencies in meting out punishment, and that is gender. And not only does God choose to punish Miriam, but also to humiliate her by afflicting her with these horrible white scales as a visible sign of her disobedience, so that everyone can see this. And that to me is just, extraordinary. That's retributional, not punishment, because not only, I guess, does she challenge Moses and his divine relationship, but also God's authority, and women just don't do that.
Right. So look, I think there's a really interesting thing for us here, which is I think we are all really comfortable with the idea that when we are in relationship with Torah, we are in a critical relationship with it. That is a conversation that we have, right? And so Linda, that's a great example, right? When we read a story like that, we feel empowered to be in critical relationship with it. I suppose the question for us when we're talking about a legal tradition is, what does it mean for us to be in a critical relationship with a legal tradition that essentially says, this is how you should behave? And if we are going to say, and I think we would, that is not authoritative for us because it doesn't reflect our values, our Jewish values as much as not just our Western values, but our Jewish values, then there's a question about our relationship with that whole corpus. Our relationship with Torah is supposed to be critical. It's supposed to be dialogical, but we're also inheritors of a legal tradition, and our relationship with the legal tradition is supposed to be one of subservience and of obedience. So what does it mean to be a religious tradition that says we are not going to be obedient to the legal tradition which we inherit? What is that? And how do we make those decisions? And how do we decide which ones we're going to be obedient to and which ones we're not going to be obedient to?
Well, I think I was interested that you described the Talmud and its conversations as a set of ideas. And it was then codified into law.
Yeah.
I think that was a big mistake. And I think we're allowed to think that.
Right.
And we believe that Torah was written by men, and the code of law definitely, because we know their names. And so, they say stuff about women that's quite unpleasant and that we don't have to buy into. We don't have to feel bound by it. And because they're all man-made, we have to think about each one and see where we feel it fits or doesn't.
Great.
And I don't think that has to necessarily always be a collective decision. Obviously, if it's the community, then that has to be, but some of them may be a personal decision.
Great. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate the incredibly radical theology that Susan just shared with us, right? Because actually that's an extraordinary thing to say. Actually, when, to say something that happened in our tradition was a mistake. And I think, I've often thought that codification exercise was the beginning of a closing down of our religious tradition in a way which has only been damaging, right? If you think about kind of the rabbinic exercise of the first centuries as a real kind of intellectual flourishing and opening up of a conversation across generations, a conversation that we are still part of, a conversation about Torah, but not a conversation limited to Torah. Actually, just how powerful that is, and actually, often Talmud is read as if it is a book of law, but it is not. It's a book of ideas that has laws in it, right? But what happens when it becomes a legal tradition? Actually, that's quite limiting for us, and we can say that wasn't our moment. But we also need to recognize it may be a book of ideas that's got laws in it, but it's still got laws in it, right? There is still an idea, a core idea in our tradition that it matters how we behave, and our tradition has views about what God wants us to do. And it's a radical theological statement to say, I don't think that's right. I don't think those things are the things that God wants us to do. And I, as an individual living in the 21st century, am empowered and authoritative to come to a different conclusion to my predecessors. Right? It is legitimate for me to dig my own well to drink the water of Torah, rather than only being able to drink from the well of the generations that came before me. That is a radical statement. I mean, I think it is progressive Judaism, but it's a radical. We shouldn't ignore how radical that is. Okay, let's just look together at some of the kind of ideas from our tradition in the past. I'm going to take us through some of the things that our predecessors have said about these kinds of questions, and then we'll have the opportunity to reflect a little bit more together as well. But what we've got here is two real articulations of what is progressive Judaism from the very earliest layers of Reform and Liberal Judaism in this country. So the first is from someone called David Wolf-Marx. David Wolf-Marx was the first minister of the West London Synagogue of British Jews after its founding in 1840. And he was in many ways a radical in lots of ways. Interestingly, there was a sort of a mismatch between his theological radicalism and the people who set up West London, and it didn't always kind of stick, as we'll see. But he was really good at articulating something really important here. So this is what he wrote in 1842. We must not confound the form with the substance. We must not regard an infinity of ceremonials as the final aim of religion, viewing as secondary all that is moral, all that is spiritual, all that embraces the eternal salvation of man. Okay, what does he mean? I think what David Wolf-Marx is saying is from the very, very earliest layer of progressive Judaism in this country is not to reject this legal framework, but to say how important it is not to think that that is what religion is about. That obedience to this, as he calls it, infinity of ceremonials, is not the core purpose of religious life. The core purpose of religious life is that it makes us better people, that it allows us to engage with the big spiritual, theological questions of our time, and as he put it, to engage with all that embraces the eternal salvation of man. One of the driving things of that early progressive Judaism was to acknowledge something I think really important, which is you can behave in a way that is entirely in line with lots of this legal tradition and not be a religious person as we would understand it. That obedience in and of itself does not make you a moral person, a spiritual person, someone who is connected in with God. There's something else in there as well. And that's a distinctively progressive voice that has continued through the last 180 years. That actually it is possible, as Nachmanides, the medieval commentator, said it, to be a naval birshut Torah, like a rogue who keeps Torah. In itself, obedience is not enough unless it's coming from the right place and enabling us to grow and be better people. It's a very strong progressive idea from the very earliest layer of rabbinic Judaism, of progressive Judaism. From the earliest layers of liberal Judaism, something from Claude Montefiore, who was one of the drivers of the early Jewish Religious Union and really the kind of intellectual beating heart in many ways of early liberal Judaism. This is what he says. We stand for the conception that religion is progressive. However much we owe to and draw from the past, we cannot be bound to it or a certain product of it in the sense that we are to see exactly as it saw. Religion grows. The Judaism of today will, we trust, be found inferior in many things to the Judaism of 200 years hence. What's Claude Montefiore telling us? That we are inheritors of this stuff. We draw from it. This is a particular product of it, of that kind of religious life. But if we believe that religion is progressive, we cannot be bound to it. We cannot have it be so authoritative in our lives that we're not able to move away from it when, for example, it is in tension with the religious values that we hold as being important. Very early on within progressive Judaism in this country, a recognition that this stuff was, as we might call it, formative. It helped to form the religious life that we have, but can't be normative. It can't tell us what to do and us still believe in a religion that is progressive and evolving. So what then do we do with our legal tradition? How do we engage with it? I said David Wolf Marx was radical theologically. I just want to whiz through him slightly because he was very odd in terms of his relationship with our legal tradition. David Wolf Marx was what is sometimes called a neo-Karaite. That is, the Karaites were a group who believed in the authority of Torah, but not the authority of rabbinic literature. So they tried to live a religious life that was obeyed the mitzvot, but didn't understand the halakha, the rabbinic traditions, as being authoritative. And that, rather bizarrely, was the position of the first progressive minister in the UK, David Wolf Marx. So he said in this text from 1842 that the Talmuds, the Mishnah and the Talmuds, we know that these books are human compositions. And though we are content to accept with reverence from our post-biblical ancestors advice and instruction, we cannot unconditionally accept their laws. For Israelites, there is but one immutable law, the sacred volume of the scriptures, commanded by God to be written down for the unerring guidance of his people until the end of time. So as a neo-Karaite, what David Wolf Marx said is that everything I've shown you this evening is not authoritative. We can't accept it. We're content to accept with reverence its advice and instruction. But what he maintained was that Torah is the literal word of God and to be obeyed. I'm not quite sure how that expressed itself in his religious life, but it is an interesting theological position. And it's one that still has echoes today in progressive Judaism. So often people will talk about the greater authority of the Bible, and particularly our prophetic tradition, than our rabbinic tradition. And what they're implying as they do that is that there is some greater authority to Torah or Bible, some greater kind of divinity to it. And whilst they're not neo-Karaites, they're kind of, dipping a toe in the water of Karaitism, probably. And it's a question for us. Do we make a differentiation between our earlier texts and their authority and our more recent texts and the rabbinic texts? We are, within Orthodox Judaism, both of them would be understood to be reflective of God's will. Both written Torah and oral Torah are understood within Orthodoxy to be the will of God. Do we think that there is a greater divinity to Torah and to Bible than we do to the rabbinic interpretation of it? David Wolf Marx clearly did. His successor, however, Reverend Maurice Joseph, who took over from him at West London, sort of pricked that bubble quite nicely. This is what he said in 1903, after a few years of being David Wolf Marx's successor. It has been deemed the characteristic function of progressive Judaism to reject the traditional view on the binding authority of the Talmud and to keep Judaism strictly within the four corners of the Bible. This is, he says, a position which is clearly self-contradictory, seeing that no religion can be progressive which is identified only with certain phases of it. That is what Maurice Joseph says, is if we believe in our Judaism as progressive, we don't get to write out of the story bits of the progress that our religion made. To say that one bit of it is more sacred than another bit because it's earlier is absolutely counter to the idea of progressive Judaism, which says that we can be on a journey of progress. It implies that we are moving away from rather than towards. And it's a really powerful thing that often when we think about what our Judaism is, we might want to reflect on, which is, if we genuinely believe in progress, then how do we kind of take in all of those bits? So a little bit in kind of, in contrast to what Susan and I were saying about the codification exercise, that was also part of the progress. It doesn't mean it was necessarily good progress, but it was part of the journey that we make. And then he points something else out as well, which is, even if we decide that we don't recognize the authority of rabbinic literature, in practice, it is impossible for us not to treat it as somehow authoritative in our lives. So he goes on, moreover, this view has proved to be impossible in practice. Its advocates have inconsistently to fall back upon the rabbinical citron at tabernacles and the traditional ram's horn at New Year. They borrow the feast of dedication from post-biblical ordinances and the whole framework of their liturgy from Talmudic and post-Talmudic sources. What is Maurice Joseph pointing out about our religious lives? That actually the stuff of Judaism, including the stuff of progressive Judaism, is largely rabbinic. So he points to the etrog and to shofar, which are rabbinic in the way that we use them and in their origin. He points to Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, as he calls it, which is not biblical at all. And of course, what he speaks to is the fact that when we pick up our siddur, whether it is Seder HaTfilot or Lev Chadash or singers, what we're picking up is the product of Talmudic and post-Talmudic sources. So when I introduced the halachot with the text from Talmud, with the text about Shavuot from the Torah, the Arba Turim. Why? Because all of us quoted our legal tradition, who were in shul over Shavuot, when we said our Amidah. All of us quoted that text. All of us sang Hallel because it says so in the Talmud. And all of us called Shavuot Zman Matan Toratenu because that's what the rabbis called it. It is never referred to that anywhere in Torah. So there's an impossibility to a complete rejection of our legal tradition, even though someone like David Wolf Marx might have wanted us to do that. This is very beautifully expressed by Rabbi Dr. Mark Wachowski, who is the professor of Jewish law at Hebrew Union College, who is an exceptional writer, and I will recommend some books by him to anyone who wants to email me. But this is what he writes. The very stuff, we're at the bottom of the page, the very stuff of our religious life as Reform Jews, he's American, he means all of us, in other words, is halachic. The ways we pray, celebrate, commemorate, and mourn, even in our liberal and modern style, are modes of sacred action that we've inherited from the rabbinic legal tradition. And it is to that tradition, to the Talmud and to the codes, the commentaries and the responsa, the kind of the written responses to questions, that we must turn if we wish to know this heritage and understand ourselves as Jews. That is, whether we wish to give it authority or not, the texts that we looked at are ones which inform everything that we do in our life as progressive Jews. When we pick up our siddur, when we have life cycle events, when we are going through the festival cycle, all of those ritual acts are rooted in our legal tradition. Most of them are not in Torah, or if they're in Torah in such a vague shape that they are that we couldn't keep them in a kind of Karaite way. So necessarily we are engaged with our legal tradition, engaged with the rabbinic tradition, whether we like it or not. It's impossible not to be. And so we are halachic Jews, in as much as we're engaged with our legal tradition, but clearly there are bits of that legal tradition that we're deeply uncomfortable with. Just one quick other quote from our teacher, Rabbi John Rayner. Rabbi John Rayner, who is a really kind of the liberal rabbi par excellence of kind of the generation above, was a very strong advocate for our engagement with halachic literature, with our legal tradition. Not only because he acknowledged that we have to be, but because he actually said it was something that enriches us as well. To reject halakha would be to reject one of the greatest elements of our Jewish heritage. It is halakha which has kept us mindful of the need to translate the theory of our faith into practice and to apply it to all aspects of life. It is halakha, but not only halakha, which has preserved the unity of the people through a tempestuous history. And it is halakha which has enlisted the most strenuous intellectual exertions of our scholars for 2,000 years. To reject the halakha would therefore be an act of unthinkable self-impoverishment and self-emasculation. So what John is teaching us, and John was a very strong advocate for us really engaging with the question of how do we think about our legal tradition in a as progressive Jews, is that two things I think he's saying. Number one is it is a rich source of our intellectual life to engage with the sort of halachot that we began with, but also that there is a core idea within the concept of being a legal tradition, which is the idea of us being obliged to behave in certain ways. So in distinction to David Wolf Marx, with whom we began, who said, all this ceremonial stuff, that's not what religion is really about. What John is saying is it can't only be about the moral and the spiritual, because if we don't put that faith into practice and apply it to all aspects of our lives, then we lose sight of what really matters in terms of the way that we live Jewish life. And that's why, for example, when we think about visiting the sick, it's one of the reasons I brought that text. The idea of visiting the sick is not just a nice idea that we do because it's a nice thing to do and it makes us feel good, or because we've got some vague idea of a kind of moral obligation or religious obligation. We do it because it's a religious obligation. Mitzvah levaker hacholim. It's a mitzvah to visit the sick. If we live in the frame of Jewish life, some things that we do because we're obliged to do them, because we live in a world of duty and religious obligation. And that's articulated by existing within a legal framework. We looked at texts which were powerful articulations of our religious obligation to be good to each other. We looked at texts which were the formative material of Jewish life, without which we wouldn't know how to do Shavuot. We also looked at texts which were excluding, which said, all this religious life, it's not for all of you. It's for some of you only. And we also looked at a text which said, bits of your life which actually are secular, we also want to tell you how to do as well. And every bit of your life, we want to have a say in and a voice in, even the bits which actually aren't about your religious life or your moral life or your spiritual life at all, potentially. So how do we differentiate? How do we make a decision that some of these are going to be formative or normative for us, are going to have authority, and others we're going to say, actually, we can step away from these? So a few different kind of texts from our forebears to explain some of the ideas. So we're returning first to Claude Montefiore. So Claude Montefiore, interestingly, for someone who kind of was one of the founding intellectual greats of liberal Judaism, was very clear that rabbinic literature is part of Jewish tradition that liberal Jews needed to take seriously. The idea of development for which we stand is inconsistent with the absolute authority and final perfection of any particular book, he says. Right? You can't constrain what God wants from you or your relationship with God into some book or code. We therefore do not take up the attitude of the earlier Jewish reformers towards the Bible and Talmud. We do not allow the authoritative power to the former and deny it to the latter. That's a dig at David Wolf Marx, by the way. And this is what he says. We recognize the Spirit of God in the Talmud as well as in the Bible. The Talmud also contains many good and true words. And what is good and true has its source in God. So what Montefiore is telling us is that actually there's another level of analysis that we can bring when we think about our relationship with the legal tradition, which is not only is it there, do we have to do it, but is it good? Is it good and true? Now, that's going to introduce to us all sorts of questions about how we know. But the differentiation he's making is that some of our legal inheritance might well be divine. What's good and true has its source in God. But of course, the reverse will also be true, that there will be things in there which are not good and true. And as John Rayner would have put it, to treat those things as if they are divine will is a Chilul Hashem, is a desecration of God's name. So John was very strong in saying we have a religious obligation to make these differentiations, because to say that stuff which is not good and not true is divine is to desecrate God's name. Similar kind of idea articulated by another rabbi of West London Synagogue, Harold Reinhardt, who was Reinhardt was really the person who drove the growth of Reform Judaism in the UK. He was an American rabbi who came over. He was the person who brought West London Synagogue into the World Union of Progressive Judaism, which had been set up largely at LGS a few years earlier. But also he was the driver of the expansion. He was behind the creation of my own community, Aleph, in many ways. Like he helped to push Aleph forwards. Though interestingly, Aleph's first rabbi was the rabbi who had set up West Central Liberal Synagogue. So we've always all been progressive Jews. Anyway, this is what he says. We assert the right and the duty to change and adapt. We lay a different emphasis upon past revelation as opposed to present than do our Orthodox brothers. That is, we understand revelation as being something that is ongoing. It's not more authoritative by virtue of being in the past. For us, the teachings of the past have authority insofar as they are able to convince us and to find justification in our own conscience. But the authority for ultimate decision is the voice of God in our own hearts. So when we are reading any text, but particularly when we're thinking about the authority of our legal tradition, actually we have to be able to judge the divinity, the sanctity of that tradition, and the ultimate authority has to be the voice of God in our own hearts. We cannot do something that is asking us to behave in a way that we feel we cannot with integrity call a sacred act, just because it's there in our legal tradition. It's an incredibly powerful articulation of our individual personal obligation within progressive Judaism. A few more modern kind of articulations of that. So this is from Rabbi Dr. Tony Bayfield. There was an attempt to begin to do a kind of collective theology within Reform Judaism about 30 years ago, which found its articulation. You can see the whole thing. So Manna, all of Manna, which was the magazine of the Sternberg Center, which had Reform, Liberal, and Masorti, and actually Orthodox people on its editorial board. It sought to be a kind of cross-communal intellectual work. So you can find all of the back editions of Manna, including some amazing articles by all of our teachers on the Liabeck College website. But this is from a collective theological essay that Tony Bayfield tried to bring different ideas together. Rabbinic Judaism developed a code of law or practice, halakha, which sought to express revelation in the details of everyday behavior. Whilst respecting the halachic system as a dominating aspect of our inheritance, we do not believe that a system of law is adequate to enable all contemporary Jews to express their relationship with God and other human beings. That is, it's not enough to abdicate our responsibility for our religious lives to the halakha, to say that we are not responsible because it's there as part of our legal tradition. Rather, he goes on, we're a little bit further down, progressive Judaism believes that individuals must formulate, sorry, your faces are all in the way, must formulate their own patterns of Jewish practice. this is to be achieved through a process of study and exploration. We accept the plurality of responses that emerge. But there's this tension that we've got within our tradition. On the one hand, we are inheritors of a tradition that says how we behave matters, and this is the voice of our tradition about what we ought to do and be. That seeks to prescribe aspects of our behavior. On the other hand, we have another tradition, which is the tradition of progressive Judaism, which is that we have a moral religious obligation for ourselves, which is not just to abdicate our religious responsibility to that text, but to be in deep conversation and ongoing conversation with it. And the really important thing that we have to do is to seek to behave in a way that we understand as being God's will for us. And that might be articulated in our legal tradition. And our legal tradition will be the formative thing that shapes a lot of our religious life, but it won't always be. And when it isn't, we have to be brave enough to say that we're not bound by it. Simone, you wanted to ask a question.
When you look at the UN conventions, it often talks about progression. UN conventions like the rights of persons with disabilities. The European Convention on Human Rights talks about it being revolving and a living document. So if that's the case in terms of international and domestic law, then it kind of makes logical sense that is the case in terms of religious practice as well.
It's called progressive Judaism, not as some differentiation to kind of or implication that there's a regressive Judaism, but because of a belief in progress, right? We don't think that change is a slippery slope that we fall down. We believe that we're going up the mountain together. And actually that's a principle in many legal traditions. And we believe it's one that retains its power in our tradition as well. Helen, you're next, Helen Brown.
Oh, my Josh, thank you so much. You make me realize how much I love the prophet Micah, having reduced all 613 mitzvot to 3.
Indeed.
But I do notice also that you mixed up ritual and ethical halakha, but you didn't specifically say that, which I thought was quite clever, because it means that we have to look at both when we're thinking about our own personal life. Yeah.
So first thing to say is the idea that Micah takes 613 and turns it into 1 is rabbinic. It's found in Masechet Makot of the Babylonian Talmud. So we can't escape the rabbis, whatever we do, because it was their idea. So anyway, but I think one of the things to say is, I think one of the insights of our tradition is that separating the ritual and the ethical is not kind of how we think about our lives. We have to think much more holistically about our engagement with all of those things. Like if you look at, Leviticus 19, the holiness code is the most obvious example. The holiness code doesn't understand holiness only in terms of ritual or only in terms of the ethical. It understands them as being interwoven. You kind of it jumps from Shabbat to how we treat our parents, right? And so we have to think of those as being whole things. We cannot live as religious people in one space, but not in another space. Claire.
Just there's something that's been haunting me recently, which is the idea that we're doing something together as a group, as a big group with all kind, and if there isn't some halakhic continuity there, then we're basically, as progressive Jews, we're all going to go off and decide what feels right for me, what's true for me. And part of the beauty, I think, for me, of a more traditional way of looking at Judaism is to see it as, well, we do this not because it feels necessarily so good, but because we're doing this as a group, right. And we're doing this to keep something alive.
Certainly one of the things that you find often in the writings about our legal tradition in progressive Jewish literature is there has to be a bias in favor of this stuff, because we have a bigger obligation, and the bigger obligation is the obligation to community and the obligation to be transmitters of tradition. So one that says we can start from a base point of doing nothing and then we just add little bits is not progressive Judaism. Progressive Judaism says we have to be in deep relationship with the material, but and it is okay to say we're not bound by bits, but there has to be some kind of presumption in favor of Jewish tradition if we are going to be the people who pass this on. And that's really important. I think the other thing that you've said, which is so crucial, is being community is about doing things that you don't necessarily want to do, right? It's about there's a kind of an idea of like simsum of sort of self-limiting that happens in order to be in relationship with other people, right? And so one of the things that drives us is that we're in relationship with other people, and therefore, and in this context, we're in relationship with other people in the context of Jewish life. So when, for example, if we had time to study the text about putting on our shoes, I don't care how you put your shoes on in the morning, Claire. But if we were all together and we all agreed that we were going to put our shoes on according to Shulchan Aruch, and one of us said, no, I'm not, I'm going to do it differently, that would not be the same kind of statement. That would be a statement about how I am in relationship with other people. It would be doing something different. And the decision that we have to limit our own, we have personal autonomy. That personal autonomy is sacred. And we also choose to limit our autonomy in order to live in relationship with other people, because that's the nature of community, right? It's also the nature of every relationship we ever had, right? We don't say what we think. We don't do what we want to do. We respect the fact that to be in relationship with other people, we limit our autonomy. It is one of the great horrors. So this is a different sermon, but one of the great horrors of modern life, that people think they can say whatever they want and it doesn't have impact.
And in
anyway,
relationship with God as well.
Right, absolutely. Stuart.
Are there no fundamental truths or absolutes that are being held, or is everything up for argument or abandoning? So could you, for example, disagree with the Shema? And you're also saying things like if something is positive and morally correct and so on, then you follow it, but otherwise not. So I'm trying to remember the name. Is it Chukim, where there's laws that are there that we don't know why they're there? Are you saying we just reject all of those as well?
What's distinctive about progressive Judaism is we think that personal autonomy is a gift that we are given. It's part of our divine nature, that we have the ability to grapple and we have moral and religious intuition. But how do we then, what are the boundaries of that? I think that is like one of the big questions. I think Claire identified one of the boundaries, which is that there is a boundary about what it is to live in Jewish community, right? If I may have all sorts of theological reactions to what's in the liturgy, but I'm in community, so I sing with the people next to me, right? That's the reality of what it is to live in Jewish community. But I also have an obligation to the tradition itself, right? I sing not only because I'm sat next to people who are singing, but because for thousands of years, these are the words that Jews have sung. And that does have a normative weight for us. There is a normative weight of that history and a normative weight of that folk tradition. Now, one of the challenges is, what do we do when some of those? I never said, by the way, you only do the stuff that's good, but I did say that we have a religious obligation not to do the stuff that's not good. And I think that's a distinctive voice about progressive Judaism, that actually we're not bound to do things that we know are wrong, or that we know are destructive, or that we know are counter to our religious needs, because they are there in our legal tradition.
Yeah, I was making
right. But I think but yes, it's really difficult. Like there is something very amazing, but also very challenging about what it is to live in a non-dogmatic religious life, which is what we are.
One of the queries was about Hakeem, what you do about laws that don't seem positive or negative.
Right. So look, I think the chukim, interestingly, I mean, we're into rabbinics already, because that whole idea of the chukim as being that is a rabbinic idea. I think many of our traditions are not ones which we can say we understand why they are what they are. I think we as progressive Jews ask other questions of them, and one of the questions we ask is, does this add meaning to my life? Right? Does this add meaning to my community's life? Right? Ultimately, there's all sorts of things we do that don't make sense as people of religion, because they add meaning to our lives and the lives of people around us. And therefore we are, and some things we do because that's what Jews do, right? And that's also very powerful, right? I think the legal question is, do we understand that as being a legal framework that obliges us, or do we understand it as being something that we positively choose to engage with as an expression of our religious obligation we feel, that religious imperative to be in community? One of the most powerful things someone said to me when I was first ordained as a rabbi is, the thing about progressive rabbis is that you don't have the power to compel, you only have the power to persuade. And it's true, right? In progressive Jewish life, we don't have the power to compel, right? None of you have to be here, right? What we do have is the ability to persuade by creating a Jewish life which is rich and scholarly and exciting and meaningful, and creates the connections that you only get in communal life, which creates space for the divine presence, right? Like that's the task we share together. And that, I find it deeply persuasive, right? But it isn't just one of kind of obligation. It's not one you have to do. Larry.
I'm going to come down to earth a bit, Josh.
Sure.
I'm conscious as a committed progressive Jew that it's quite easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Or in other words, in the immortal song of Cole Porter, in olden days, a glimpse of stocking was thought of as something shocking. Now, heaven knows anything goes.
Sure. Look, I honestly, personally, I really hear that, Larry. I think for me there is a question. Do we think we're on a slippery slope in which, as we approach these questions, there's a risk that we're going to kind of slide down to the bottom? Or do we think that we're on a hike up the mountain, shaping together a religious life that's really powerful together? I'll use a different analogy. Rabbi Colin Imer speaks about, he doesn't mean this in any talks about when you make cordial or squash, right? Like, actually the squash that you drink is not the concentrated stuff, right? And there comes, it's not that we kind of add so much water that you can't taste the squash, but actually you do have to create a squash that's perfect. And that does mean finding that spot where you have a religious life that tastes right. Post-merger, we did all sorts of interviews. You've probably seen a lot of them. One of the interviewers said to us, lots of people say that progressive Judaism is going to die because none of you are going to have Jewish children and only Orthodox Judaism is sustainable. And I said, I'm sure they said that to Jacobson 250 years ago. But we've done 250 years of this, right? David Wolf Marx was radical and amazing theologically and ritually. And people will have said to him, and they did, anything goes. It's the top of the slippery slope. And 180 years later, we're still here, right? We're still doing that work. And I think there is that thing, which is I'm not worried. Personally, I'm not worried about the slippery slope. I'm not worried about anything goes. Because what I see around me in every shul that I go to is people trying to positively create rich, meaningful Jewish life that binds them in a different way. And I'm very proud of the progressive Judaism that we have. David, you're going to get the last question, the last word. I'm sorry, I could do this all evening, but I probably shouldn't.
What if you don't believe in God? How come one keep Jewish law then? Should you keep Jewish law if you don't believe in God?
Wow. So look, I think there's so one of the things I think is really special about progressive Judaism, and I think it's pretty unique in terms of the religious life of the world, is that we're genuinely non-dogmatic. When you come into shul, no one is going to ask you, can you just tick these beliefs and say you believe them in order to come and sit down, right? There is no kind of theological register as you come in to make sure that you believe the right thing. And there are people who are deeply committed to religious life, who don't believe in, as they always say, that don't believe in the God. I don't believe in the God you don't believe in, right? It's like, but who understand that we are doing something powerful together. Now, there are one of the things I think is incredibly wonderful about Judaism is We have all sorts of different God imagery and God metaphors in our tradition. And some of them really don't work for me. The idea of a kind of judging God or a military God at Nights of Art does not work for me. But I know, because I live it when I'm in community, that when we come together in acts of loving kindness or in prayer or in study, we create space for the divine presence to dwell among us. And I know it because I experience it, right? Because it's a powerful part of progressive Jewish life. Now, that is not something I think that comes out of obligation, but I do think there is a very strong sense of the obligation we all hold to do that work together, to fulfill that task together.